Hey gang, and welcome to our discussion of Winnie-the-Pooh. I may have been a teensy bit overzealous with how much content I wanted to get through here, so I'm going to be splitting the lecture into two parts. This first one, I'm going to talk about children's literature as a bit more in general, and go over those daily key quotes and introduce the Pooh stories. The second part, which I'll post tomorrow, will go through the chapters themselves. Just like with the fairy tales, there's no way for me to go through every chapter thoroughly, so I'll just be hitting the high points for each chapter. But for today, let's get into those key quotes first. Our first key quote comes from Peter Hunt, who wrote Oxford's introductory primer to critically studying children's literature. He explains, quote, "Children's books reflect the world as we would like it to be. They react to the adult world." Children's literature is often coined as presenting this ideal world, something our next quote is going to get into a bit more. But it's more than just trying to sanitize or putting this world back in order. It's a reaction. If children's literature is reflecting or reacting to our world, if it's trying to present a perfect or idealized version of our world, then that is a blatant acknowledgement that our world is broken, or at least imperfect. So, as we mentioned with audience last week in the fairy tales, children's literature as a whole has to be considered in this dual sense. The ways in which children's literature draws attention to how the adult world is in some way imperfect or incomplete, and how the literature reacts to that and gives us what we want. That's a special kind of power that is akin to something like wish fulfillment, and for both the children and adult readers. Perry Nodelman is one of the bigwigs in children's literature, and his major text, The Hidden Adult, spends much of its time highlighting that dual audience in children's literature. Adult nostalgia is one of the biggest points for Nodelman, as he explains in this quote. Speaking about children's literature, he claims, quote, "The text seems to emerge from and express an adult nostalgia for childhood as an idyll or Eden, a simpler and better time now over. They seem to conjure this sense of nostalgia in order to block out the knowledge of, or acknowledging the knowledge of, the actual complexity and uncertainty of childhood for both children and adults." Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here, so we're going to take it phase by phase. Let's start with this concept about nostalgia. Nostalgia, if you're not familiar with the term, is this longing for something past or lost. You may feel nostalgic about a certain location you and your family took on a trip to, or you might be nostalgic about a certain song that was playing when you and your significant other first met, or you might be nostalgic about the 1991 animated cult classic Darkwing Duck series, starring the incredible voice acting talents of Jim Cummings as the titular superhero, whose impeccable performance as the terror that flaps in the night still brings tears to your very eyes. Anywho, what's important to note about nostalgia is that it often sanitizes memory, cleans up the parts we don't want to remember. When you think about that perfect vacation from your childhood, you ignore the fact that you fought with your sibling for 18 hours in that car ride because that's not fun to remember, or that your favorite childhood cartoon was actually kind of sexist at times. You ignore those things because you prefer the good feeling that nostalgia can give you. And we often think of childhood in this way, remembering fondly those perfect childhood days and subsequently forgetting the bad stuff. But along with that, there's a sense of loss. You can't be nostalgic for something you currently have or are experiencing. You can only be nostalgic for something gone or absent. So if one is nostalgic about childhood, that suggests that childhood is something that is finite, that will eventually be lost or taken or grown out of. This concept of loss rides in the background of much of children's literature. It kind of lurks there, daunting and kind of creepy when you start to think about it. But this is something that Peter Pan is going to be dealing with a bit more specifically, so we're going to put a pin in that until next time. And then there's the second part of Nodelman's quote here. Childhood was not perfect. It was not an Eden where everything just worked out, no matter what our nostalgia may say. So much of children's literature, according to Nodelman, is attempting to unveil those less comfortable moments we'd rather forget about childhood. Children's literature often is trying to show how complex and uncertain being a child can be. This often takes the form of the child character's agency, or power to control and order the world and their actions. To say that someone doesn't have agency means that they have no power. So look for places where children in these texts vie for that agency, or exert it, or have agency taken away from them. You'd be surprised how often it becomes a critical part of the plot. Finally, we have this quote from Humphrey Carpenter, one of the leading experts on the golden age of children's literature, which began in England around the mid-1850s and lasted through the early 1900s. Most consider Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to be the start of this age, and indeed, most of the famous works of children's literature you think of come from this time period, including Little Women, Tom Sawyer, Treasure Island, Peter Pan, and Jungle Book, and so on. This shift occurred as authors stopped talking down to children. They stopped trying to shove morals down their throat with the literature. This style was called didacticism, and Carroll's Alice was one of the first to break away from this mode and just let his child character explore, learn, and grow on her own terms. It was a revolutionary idea and drew an interesting distinction between adults, both in the fiction and reality, and the child reader and the characters. And it's this distinction that Carpenter is getting at with this quote. Oh no, someone's guest starring. Specifically talking about the Pooh books, Carpenter explains, quote, "The only real adult in Pooh's world is Christopher Robin, a nicely ironic inversion which puts a neat frame around the stories." Indeed, all of the characters in the Pooh stories, the adult narrator included, turn to Christopher Robin for guidance, instruction, and authority. Having a child Having a child character in this sort of powerful role creates not just irony, but a means by which readers can consolidate a child's place in the world, as well as the power they can have to shape that world for others around them. So let's talk about the author, A. Milne, for a quick second. I'm dying to get into the stories, but ultimately, and uniquely, the author is just as much a character in the story as anyone else. Milne was born in 1882, and in addition to being an excellent author and playwright, he served in both World War I and World War II, alongside other excellent children's authors, such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I'm realizing a trend with these initials now. In 1913, Milne married, and in 1920, he and his wife had their son, Christopher Robin, who would later become the inspiration and, in some ways, co-author of the famous Pooh stories, though it was Milne's wife, Daphne, who first suggested writing out the stories and getting them published. Almost all elements of the Pooh stories are based on real life, including the characters themselves. Only Rabbit and Owl are complete fiction, and it's interesting to note that the two adult-like characters in the story are inventions of the author, something to pay attention to. On the side note, you may be wondering where Tigger was this whole time while you were reading this. Well, he doesn't come in until the second book, so I'm afraid you'll have to go out and find him yourself. And finally, as a little bonus, you can still see the original stuffed animals the characters were based on in the New York Public Library, all except for Roo, who was sadly lost. So one of the coolest things to think about in these stories is the interaction between the author and narrator Milne and the child audience, Christopher Robin, who is also a character. So Christopher Robin is a real person and a character in the story. So there's some really cool slippage that happens. I wish deeply that we had more time to go over this more in class, but such is our lot. The next lecture will have the discussion of the chapters themselves, so you can get pumped for that. Since I'm splitting this up, I'm also extending the deadline for the Winnie-the-Pooh assignment until Monday, April 6th at 11:59 p.m. So you have a little extra time to complete that. If you've already got it done or you have it done by the original due date, I'll give you some extra credit. So I'll catch you guys in the next lecture on the chapters. Until then, here's that cat blooper from earlier, and I'll see you next time. Having a child character in this sort of powerful role creates not just irony, but a means by which readers can consolidate a child's place in the world, as well as the power they can have to shape that world for others around them. Oh, you just want some camera time. You want camera time? Come here. Nope. Oh, you meow now. Ugh. Oh no. Oh no. You gonna tell them about Winnie the Pooh? Huh? Gonna tell them about Winnie the Pooh? No? Okay. All right. Cut. Okay, cut.